Yeah, so Sarah and I are environmental management educators with Michigan State Extension, so we work with a lot of poop, basically. But we also do a lot with nutrient management, and so Sarah is based down in Hillsdale County, which is, she does a lot more with the,
Right, yeah, so we have a Michigan map built in, which is right. So I'm right here. And Erica's more toward like the middle of the hand.
Yeah. So we've been working a lot in the Western Lake Erie Basin as well. I think Sarah probably more so than I have, but the other area that we're really starting to focus into and that we have a lot of people concerned about is the Saginaw Bay, which is our little bay right here in the thumb region, for those of you who aren't familiar with Michigan. So yeah, we've been doing a lot of work, and we've got a few online tools. We're kind of going to base it off of our 4R scenario, so we won't dive too much into the details of that necessarily, but kind of show how some of these tools really fit well into these 4R practices. So we'll go through each of the tools based on that. And if you guys have questions as we go along, feel free to ask. That's just fine.
Right, and all the tools that we're going to talk about today are absolutely free.
Yes.
Yeah, so people like to hear that. All right. So we talked a little bit about 4Rs already today, but if you've changed rooms or you're not sick of hearing it already, so we're going to take the basic 4R framework: right source, right rate, right time, right place. And we're going to use that and talk about these tools. So the first one.
Yeah, so our first one is going to be right source. So this was actually something that I've utilized from one of my professors, Doug Beagle. Some of you might know him from Penn State. And his nutrient management class was just a real eye-opener for me, which really got me started into the idea of manure and loving all things to do with manure. So I can thank him for that. But essentially when we talk about the right source, and I know Aaron was talking a lot about matching soil to, whatever crop needs are, as well as the manure analyses, and why it's so important to have both a soil analysis as well as a manure analysis, right? So we want to be able to match those nutrients as far as the crop and what that crop needs. And so if we take, just as an example, this would be our corn crop requirement for nutrients. And if we get our dairy manure analyzed, these would be roughly what our dairy manure nutrient concentrations would look like. So in Michigan, we also have an issue with phosphorus and with nitrogen. A lot of our focus has been on phosphorus at this point. So a lot of our soil recommendations are based on that phosphorus. So in Michigan, if you hit 150 parts per million of phosphorus per acre, you cannot apply any more phosphorus, and so therefore manure is not an option on that field. Okay, so that's why it's really important. We encourage a lot of our producers to get those soil analyses to see where they lie with that. So when we look at these differences here, if we really want to apply to hit that nitrogen requirement of our corn, we're gonna go over on our phosphorus. Now, if we're in a field that's lower in phosphorus, I don't want to say that that's okay, but we're in a better position, and that's maybe not necessarily such a concern at that point. However, if we are applying at a crop removal rate for phosphorus, so there's kind of some tiers essentially within the soil test as far as how much phosphorus you can apply. So if I get into that middle tier, essentially, I need to apply phosphorus at a crop removal rate, and at that point, I'm not supplying enough nitrogen for my corn. So that's where I got to look at potentially purchasing some commercial fertilizer. So this is just a really good example of why we emphasize the idea of source within the 4Rs, because we need to make sure we have an understanding of what we're actually supplying. So one of the tools, and it's not one of our tools, it's actually from University of Minnesota Extension. It's a really valuable tool. It's What's Manure Worth calculator. And it's actually a really cool tool from a standpoint that it'll help you rapidly estimate the value of the manure that you have based on the manure type, your application methods, the soil nutrient status, and then also what that crop need is. And then it also basically gives you a really nice estimate of how much money you've potentially saved by using manure in place of commercial fertilizer. So I know it's a little hard to see. There's basically 3 sections that it goes through. And so once you get to that results page, it gives you a really nice rundown, for instance, of the net value of manure above the application costs. It gives you an idea of the manure available to be applied, how many acres available for manure, the manure needed to cover all acres at a selected rate. And then from there, it'll drill down and show you what you've actually saved. So it does give you the option when you select the species as far as what manure you're applying. It does give book values in there, so it kind of earmarks it. However, if you want to be as accurate as possible for your specific farm and that specific field, make sure you have an analysis of that manure because you can input your own values. And it makes a big difference when you do that.
And all of these tools, we'll have a slide at the end that has all the URLs. So if you wanted to come up and take a photo or whatever, you can do that at the end. So the next 4R we're going to talk about is right rate. And I grew up on a laying hen farm. And I don't know if any of you grew up on farms. But when it was my turn to drive the honey wagon, I drove way too fast. I wanted to get it done, and I did not put it on at the right rate. So other than getting in trouble with my dad quite often when it was my turn to put on manure, I learned a valuable lesson that it's important to make sure that we're spreading at the right rate. And it's also really important that we train the people that are doing that application. So we want to ensure that your driver is trained and all of those kind of things. Make sure that the people that are preparing the equipment are trained and understand what it looks like when that equipment is in good operating, So we also want to think about inventory. So we want to know what crops that we're going to put on and the crop yield, which you probably already are doing. But you also want to consider other nutrient sources, like did you have a bean crop there, and that gives you a nitrogen credit. And we want to take an inventory of the soil and the manure and make sure we have those samples and we have those analyses. So one of the tools that we're suggesting and that we've developed in Michigan is canmap, the Computer Assisted Nutrient Management Planning Program. And this is essentially the NRCS 590 kind of computerized. So you can enter in all that sort of nutrient management information into this and use your fields the FSA has and use your CLUs, and then you can output a report. So when you go to see NRCS, you won't be there for hours of them typing slowly into their computer and you sitting there drinking a lot of coffee. It really streamlines that whole process. I think it's also a really neat way of thinking about your fields historically, so you can look at that field year in and year out as you move on and use it in the program. And put in the next slide. So we're trying to find the Ohio equivalent to some of these because canmap is only good in Michigan. If you like it, if you go play around with it, you like it, you could talk to somebody in Ohio about building one for you. But you guys have Ohio Nutrient Management Record Keeper, and I played around with this a little bit. I kind of like it. Has anybody tried this? Just the extension people. Awesome. So this is an app that you load onto your phone, and you tell it where your field is. You can actually drive your truck out to your field and say, I'm in my field, and list your field. And then when you go out there to put on a nutrient application, it knows that you're in that field, and you say, I'm going to add another application, and you can tell it what it is, who did it, and all that stuff that you need, all those records that you need for your the new law stuff in Ohio.
H2O Ohio.
Yeah. Right? We don't have that yet, so I'm not sure what you guys call it. And you can print out a report at the end of the year. I thought that was pretty slick. I like it.
So the other ones, we've done source, we've done rate, and so the third one we're talking about is the right time. So we have also experienced, like Northwest Ohio, a lot of wet weather in Michigan this past year. So we also had a lot of manure storages that were full to bursting, quite frankly. We had a lot of preventative plant acres, a lot of emergencies declared in counties and such because of the flooding. And I think your area might have even been worse than where I was. So,
yeah, we had a lot of prevent plant just because we're in the Western Lake Erie Basin that had a lot of heavy prevent plant, but also in the Saginaw Valley,
yeah.
Which is the crook of the thumb area, which is pretty flat, kind of like here.
Yeah, so we had a lot of corn that didn't get planted until June, and soybeans were end of June. I mean, it was fun, just like what you guys experienced. So timing was a huge issue and really key for a lot of our producers with manure application. So some of the things, obviously, that we're talking about are, watching the weather. What is the weather going to be doing over the next several days when I plan my manure application? I don't want to look at just that 24-hour period. That's helpful, and I do need to look at that. But I also need to kind of plan ahead outside of that as well, because we know, especially in the summer, we tend to get some of those pop-up storms with some of that convection that we get. And so being able to kind of have a plan B and a plan C and a plan D in some cases is really important, which is why it's good to keep an eye on that weather forecast and that 7-day weather forecast and so on and so forth. So obviously recommendations are not to apply when the ground is saturated or if it's frozen, right? Those are very obvious times where we see higher runoff risk. We have a lot of tile in Michigan, which you have a decent amount of tile here too, and so that's something else that we're really conscious of as far as saturated ground is concerned. So, and obviously winter would be the least desirable time for application. Do you guys have a winter ban in Ohio at this point?
We can still apply if we have a growing crop.
Okay. So our smaller farms, our non-permitted farms, are still able to apply in the manure, although it's not recommended. Our new CAFO permit has just come out, draft permit, and at this point, there's going to be no winter spreading, basically from January to March is the idea. So we're kind of looking at some of our timing options from a different perspective now for some of these farms. So one tool that we have, and some of you may be familiar with this, is the Michigan Enviro Impact tool. And I'll talk about the tool you guys have here that's similar, and it's based off the same information. So it's a runoff risk advisory forecast. And so within that, it gives you an idea as far as what the runoff risk might be. So this is a 24-hour shot of what the runoff risk might be over the next 24 hours. And it's got two different modes, and it's based off of National Weather Service data. So NOAA has worked on this. We've had a lot of different key partners that have been a part of this. So the two modes are winter mode and then non-winter mode. So our non-winter mode are going to be like your yellows, your oranges, your reds. And so if there is a potential risk of runoff and we're in non-winter mode, these are kind of the colors we're going to see down here essentially. So if there's nothing, that tells me that there's not really that high of a risk of runoff that day, and so maybe that's a prime day for me to apply manure. But at the same time, I need to check what are my field saturation levels, right? So it does take that into account, but you still kind of got to know that field specifically and your farm specifically. When I start getting into the low and moderate, so like the yellows and oranges in here, it doesn't mean I shouldn't apply. It just means I need to think about what my fields look like. So if I have a field that has, a 12% slope in it versus a relatively flat field and I need to get my manure out, I'm probably going to choose to go with that field that's a little bit flatter from a standpoint that I don't have as high a risk of runoff, okay? But when I get into the red, I know I have a pretty good chance of runoff basically at any point in time. So if I can avoid spreading manure, I'm going to avoid at all costs. And actually, this tool isn't just manure, it's nutrient application. So this works for commercial fertilizer as well. I've even had some community members say that they think it's really cool and maybe they'll use it for their lawn fertilizer. So we go into winter mode, and that's where we get these purple and blues. And so winter mode is triggered when one of two things happens. Either there is an inch of snow or greater, or the ground is frozen. Both of those things can be happening at the same time, and a lot of times they do, but in order to trigger winter mode, only one of those things needs to be occurring. So blue would be that there's no runoff expected, but that we have winter conditions. Purple is we have winter conditions and there is a high risk of runoff. And the tool is set to be more sensitive in winter mode than non-winter mode, because we know that there tends to be a lot higher risk of runoff when we're in those winter conditions. So there's also other layers in this, so you can take a look at the precipitation, what your soil temperatures are, as well as the potential soil saturation, okay? And if you're looking to get a further out forecast, kind of like what we talked about, you can click on whatever area you're located or where you want to spread, and it'll give you a 7-day forecast as far as what it looks like over the next week or so. Obviously, just like with regular weather forecasts, the further out you get, the less accurate the forecast is, and so that's why it's important to continue checking back in, but at least it helps you plan a few days out as far as that application.
So you can drill down to your field with this, and it's pretty accurate within 7 miles.
It's a six square mile are the grid sizes. So they'd like to get it, a little bit closer than that, but for right now, the second version that it's in right, I think it's the second version it's in right now. 6 square miles are those grid sizes. So have you guys seen this? How many have seen the Ohio nutrient applicator forecast? Okay, a few more people outside of just extension. So this is essentially the same tool, but this is Ohio's version. And so how the tools differ, the data that's supplied is the same as what's supplied for the Michigan tool. Obviously, the forecast will look a little different based on location, but it's the same data coming through. What's different is the host site. So like, I think you guys, this is on the ODA website, right? Pretty sure that's where I pulled it. For us, it's hosted through Michigan State. So it just depends on the hosting website. And then the other thing that's a little different is that recommendations and some of the other suggestions are based on Ohio standards, whereas our Michigan tool, the Enviro Impact tool, is based on Michigan standards. So that's kind of where they differ a little bit. And then there's also farm Field Application Resource Monitor. This is in Ohio specifically, so we're not 100% familiar with this tool, but has anybody used this tool at all? Okay. How do you feel like it works for you? Pretty good? Yeah, I can give that a positive review. Pretty good. Yeah. Yep. Okay, so for those of you who didn't hear, you get an email every morning basically of what that weather forecast is looking like for that day, which is really helpful. And actually, that's something we have set up with our Enviro Impact tool as well. It sends out email alerts, and it'll also send out text alerts if there's a high risk that day in the area that you have pegged. So it essentially is similar to the runoff risk advisory forecast. It is a little different, but it does give you kind of this green light, red light as far as should I be applying or should I not be applying that day. So if anybody's interested, maybe talk to this gentleman here. He might be able to give you a little more information as far as what they like and don't like about it. But that's also another resource.
All right, so the next 4R is the right place. We suggest that you keep nutrients in the root zone. That's really where you want them anyway. That's where your plants are going to use them. If they're anywhere else, the plant can't get to them. Yeah, it's like the toys I keep on the top shelf away from my kids. They can't use them. We suggest that you apply on an established cover crop. Again, this isn't something that is a common practice in Michigan yet, so we're really trying to push this, that you should use cover crops, especially if you're going to be putting on nutrients. Erica talked a little bit about tiled fields. It's important to think about your tile. Is your tile running? You might not want to put on manure. If your tile is running, you should know where your tiles are, and you might not want to apply right over those tiles if possible. You need to check your tile outlets. and make sure that they're running clear after you're done applying for several days, to make sure that you didn't inadvertently cause a problem. So we also suggest that when you apply manure, you consider odor. I got a lot of phone calls because somebody applied manure at Christmas, like right the day before Christmas, and we got a warm snap, and it was so smelly. It was poultry manure. People's eyes were watering. It was really bad. I got a lot of phone calls from angry people. And I mean, the guy applied it legally, and everything was okay that way, but he made a lot of his neighbors upset. And if you're okay with that, that's one thing. But if you like your neighbors and you want to keep a friendly situation there, you might want to consider avoiding holidays if you can. You also want to try to avoid like spreading next to a church on Saturday. That's probably a bad idea. We get some complaints from hospitals and schools because of people that have asthma that can't deal with some of the fumes that come off of manure that isn't incorporated. And I just encourage you to talk to your neighbors about your spreading.
So there's actually a study done at Penn State that utilized swine manure, or swine farms, and they used neighbors or people close within the range to these farms. I can't remember what the distance was, but it was really interesting because what the study had showed was that those neighbors or people who live close that deemed themselves as healthy, that said they had a good relationship with the swine farmer, can't remember, that thought the farm looked clean and looked organized, tended to notice less odor coming from those farms than people who maybe claimed that they had some kind of chronic condition like asthma, or maybe didn't have a very good relationship with the farm, or potentially the farm looked really disorganized, right? So again, not necessarily, illegal things by that standpoint, but just some considerations when we're talking about place and just application of manure.
Yeah. So odor tends to be social.
In a lot of cases,
that's the take-home message there.
Not everybody thinks it smells like money, unfortunately.
So one of the things that we have that can help you deal with some of these issues is the sensitive area identification system. We call this SASE. And essentially, you take your field and you put in all of your management information, like, are you no-till? Did you put manure on? How did you put that manure on? And it'll spit out. It takes into account the topography and the soil types and all that kind of stuff, and it spits out a map that says these are the areas you should be worried about in this field. And when I did this on my fields, I noticed that like my grass waterway was one of the areas that I highlighted, and I was like, spot on, that's why I got a grass waterway there, right? And so what it does at the end of all that, they have a nice map that shows you where all those hot areas are, and then at the end it has a list of all the NRCS best management practices that you could go in and talk to your NRCS guy and say, hey, I think maybe I can apply for these through EQIP or something like that. So again, this is a Michigan application. We can't find one for Ohio.
And maybe there is one.
We couldn't find it.
Didn't see it.
So maybe you should ask for one. So this is kind of a practice assessment that we do with people. And the question is if this was your farm, if you just started renting this, what are the kind of things that you would want to know? So can you use a pointer? And so this used to be a livestock farm, and so that was a livestock barn. And what kind of things would you want to know if you just gained control of this piece of property?
This is interactive, by the way.
You have to answer. Fertility. You want to take some soil tests. When you look at those soil tests, if I told you that the livestock were in that long, skinny barn, where would you really expect there to be high fertility numbers, right? Yeah, like
All around.
right there next to the barn, because that was the easiest place to spread, and people didn't care for a really long time about like getting farther away. So we definitely worry about fertility in that field. What else would we want to look at? Drainage, yeah. Is this field tiled? What's the condition of the tile? Where are the outlets? How many groundhogs are in the outlets? You can actually kind of see there's like a couple like blowouts in the tile in the field. What else would I want to know? Neighbors. So you can see there are a couple houses. Maybe the farmhouse is rented out now to somebody who isn't farming. And I see one other really big red flag on this map. Erica, do you know where it is? The water.
Somebody said it.
So the St. Joseph River is flowing right along the edge of the field, and there's a big pond, and the pond isn't actually part of the river, but is actually the irrigation pond source. So good job. I think you guys got most of my stuff on my list. Yeah. Way to go.
So we'll kind of wrap this up, but just from an assistance standpoint, if you're curious about some of these tools or potential other resources that exist, especially in your state specifically, because I know not everybody here is from Ohio, right? Like you're from Pennsylvania, we're from Michigan, probably most of you are from Ohio, but regardless, your NRCS, your conservation district, extension, and private consultants are all really good people to reach out to. Obviously, it depends on the kind of relationship that you have. Every county is different, we find, in Michigan as far as how some of these people are received, and that's totally fine, right? So any of these are great resources to reach out.
We like extension better.
We might be biased in that sense, but we do work with all of these people as well and have really great relationships with them too to make sure we're all on the same page and, you know, given the same message with the latest research.
So this is the resources slide, and we'll like go past this and come back and leave this up. So if you want to come up and take a decent picture. So go to the next slide. Okay, so these are a couple of resources from MSU, and you can find the cover crop series is on YouTube. So if you want to scan that, it'll take you right to our YouTube channel. And then we have In the Weeds podcast with Monica Jean. And you can find that on Spotify and on your podcast on your iPhone. Both of these would be applicable here in Ohio. And then Amanda has a podcast too that you should probably listen to. And so I think these are, ours are really nice links. They're about 20 minutes. So you're going from one town to another. It's a nice little listen. And usually they're kind of like hot topics. So I think, I don't know, Amanda should probably tell you about hers, but.
You can ask her if you're curious. So.
All right, so go back to, that one.
So if you guys have any questions, we'd be happy to take them now or later. That's fine too. All right, that works.
Can you tell us more about this CAFO permit thing that you've got?
Yeah, so
New and different.
what's new and different? Well, we've got some pretty major things that are different. So it used to be that our CAFOs could spread manure in the winter.
CAFO defined as?
CAFO, sorry, concentrated animal feeding operation.
How big is that?
So 1,000 animal units is what qualifies that. So for instance, that would be about 700 dairy cattle, about 1,000 beef cattle, lots of chickens. I can't remember the exact number, but quite a few. 82,000. I was thinking 90 in my head, so okay, 82,000. So we have about 260-ish, give or take, CAFOs in Michigan. Most of them, besides I think one, are in the lower peninsula, essentially. So, and some are obviously more heavily populated in certain areas just because the ground is better there. It's a more ideal place. It's rural, more ag land. And so a couple of the big things that our farms are going to be facing now is no manure application between the months from January 1st to March 19th, with potential that if there's no snow or frozen, snow-covered or frozen ground from March 20th to March 31st, with notification to EGLE, which is our DEQ, our Department of Environmental Quality. They've renamed themselves to Department of Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy. So yeah, there's some conversation with that, but you have to report to them if you're going to be spreading between that March 20th and March 31st timeline. One of the other big things that's got some of our producers worried is that now if you have a field that is located within a TMDL watershed or a total maximum daily load watershed for things like E. coli, nitrogen, phosphorus, there's a couple others, but those I think are kind of the three big ones when we're talking about manure. They have to use what's called the Michigan Phosphorus Risk Assessment, which is kind of a P index essentially. And the tool was created by several different agencies and groups within Michigan, which it was never meant to be used as a regulatory tool, but is now being utilized, that they have to go through that tool. And if they score, I believe it's 11 points or lower, which is considered a low score, they can spread on that field with manure within a TMDL watershed. However, if their score is anything higher than that, that field is not able to be spread on with manure. So a lot of our producers are looking at distance challenges now.
It's really hard to get a low level field. I ran all of my farm's fields and they were all medium to high.
Yeah, so we've got some concerned producers about that. There's no manifesting of CAFO manure from January 1st until April 1st, and so that's actually starting to affect some of our crop farmers now. It's not just CAFOs that are affected by this permit anymore. So potentially, we've actually had a few crop producers come up and tell us that they're probably not going to be able to utilize CAFO manure anymore because they need it before that April 1st timeline.
Because a lot of the manure was going to some alternative crops like grapes and fruit crops, but they can't put it on in that window because of food safety rules.
Yep. So, and the other thing is those recipients of the CAFO manure now must have a soil test, current soil test within the last 3 years. I like to say I can understand the intentions behind some of these changes. Unfortunately, I don't know if they're all applicable in a realistic way. Yeah, practical. So there are quite a few other changes, but those are just some of the really big ones that are coming down the line.